Excellent. Thank you so much, Michelle.
You're welcome.
So, welcome. If I had known that I would be speaking at the same time as Dr. Bev, I would have known that I was up against some really stiff competition this morning. So, thank you all for joining. I tend to be a fairly interactive presenter. And so, if you are near a keyboard or can get near a keyboard, great. I'll have some questions for you to answer as we go through. I really wanted to kick off this conference this morning with a session, that's a bit of a twist on federal grant readiness. Instead of telling you about all the ways in which you need to get federal grant ready, we're going to talk about ways that you might actually already have signs that you're federal grant ready or moving in that direction. And so these signs are particularly helpful for mid-size and even smaller nonprofits that have not pursued federal grants before and may be hesitant or shy in considering a federal grant strategy. And we'll talk through the differences and these different signals that you might already have in place that indicate you're headed towards federal grant readiness. And we will look briefly at federal grant seeking in 2025 because we really can't have a conversation about federal grants in 2025 without talking about the shifting landscape. So thank you so much for joining. A little bit more about me. My name is Fielding Jezreel. I have a small federal grant consulting firm and I live in St. Louis, Missouri. I got started in grants like many of you, when other things did not pan out, right? I did not plan to be a grant writer and certainly did not plan to be a federal grant writer. I left graduate school wanting to write about policy, but those jobs in St. Louis anyway included community organizing, and I was not well prepared for that. In some ways, that feels a lot like putting a grant writer in a position to also be doing major donor work, right? There's something about those two jobs attracting opposite personalities. So I ended up in a grant writing job. So at least that I could use my writing and analysis skills, and the rest is history. When I started as a consultant in 2016, I knew I wanted to move quickly towards federal grants and writing almost exclusively federal grants. Yes, I'm one of those people who learned to love them very early on, but it took me a couple of years to get there. And remember, this was pre-COVID, this was 2016. And many organizations still wanted to meet with consultants in person if they were even thinking about working with consultants at all. But today, my business is primarily focused on federal grants. And yes, 2025 has been the biggest speed bump in my career. And I've spent almost a decade at this point writing federal grants primarily for small to mid-sized nonprofits in St. Louis. I've worked with clients to secure grants totaling just over 135 million and have been funded across a dozen federal agencies. So I don't have deep expertise in any one agency. I like the excitement and the learning that comes from writing across agencies. And because I have written across so many agencies, I've really distilled down sort of the key components that we really need to understand as grant writers to write federal grants, regardless of the agency. And because I've been writing federal grants for a little over a decade now, that means I've written federal grants across 3 administrations. So the second term of the Obama administration, into the first Trump presidency, through Biden's tenure, and now back into Trump's second presidency. And what I found in my work with small to mid-sized nonprofits is that there are a lot of non-traditional indicators that an organization is actually fairly well positioned for a federal grant. And these apply across administration changes. So these things do not change. Many things have changed this year, and we'll talk about those towards the end. But these sort of foundational aspects to readiness really don't change. So our topic today is just that. How can we identify when organizations are ready for federal grants? What are those non-traditional indicators that you might actually be ready? even when the traditional advice has been that federal grants are too competitive, right? They're too hard to write, they're too hard to manage. You're probably not ready. Well, I will argue that many more organizations are ready, and we're going to talk about how to tell when they are. So before we jump in, if you're willing to drop a little bit of information in the chat, so I would love to know whether you work for a nonprofit or for a government, the type of work that your organization does if you are a nonprofit. So that might be housing, health, etc. And whether you would classify your organization's budget as small, mid-size, or large. And we're all going to have slightly different definitions for that. So feel free to self-assign. And then also, I wanted to drop my LinkedIn in the chat because I am very open to connecting with folks after the summit. And I would invite you to drop your LinkedIn as well. So I'll do that while you all introduce yourselves and drop a little information in the chat as well. And I'm hoping that this chat is within the room and not just with the whole group, but we'll see.
It's in the room.
Oh, great. So let's dive in. So I'm not seeing anything in the chat, at least the chat that I'm seeing right now. Let me just make sure. And are you seeing anything, Michelle?
Actually, no.
Okay, no worries. So let's jump right in. So we're going to cover 9 different ways that I think organizations may actually be prepared for federal grants, even when they may have been told that they're not. So, number 1, organizations stay the course even when the money isn't there. We can't ignore the elephant in the room, right? Is there even federal grants at all anymore? And of course, the answer to that is yes. But they have been changing pretty quickly, right? We've seen some big shifts in the types of funding and in the cadence at which funding is being rolled out. So, number 1, this was a green flag, if you will, even before 2025, but it's even more important now than it has ever been. Your organization stays the course even when the money is not there. You do work in the communities you're rooted in, not just because the funding flows. Funders pay attention, federal funders as well as philanthropic funders pay attention to alignment and track record, and they are not looking for trend chasers. I occasionally review grants for a local funder, and one year they released a needs statement or a needs assessment of the region. And they were noting that there were not very many services in the area that they wanted to fund in a particular geographic area within the larger region. And that year, as a reviewer, I read numerous proposals that cited the need in that area, but had no history of doing work in that area and did not modify their model in any way to meet the specific needs of that community. At worst, it makes those organizations look predatory, right? And at best, they seem like money chasers. On the flip side, also in St. Louis, where I live, we recently experienced a devastating tornado. And several nonprofits stepped up to lead the cleanup, dealt with immediate services that were needed for those impacted long before the city or FEMA could jump in and help. And these organizations weren't waiting to find out if there was money available, right? This was within their wheelhouse. This was the communities they served, and they responded. And since, they have received some of the largest philanthropic gifts they have ever received. Now, we know, we're grant writers, we know that money is essential to run the sector, right? I'm not arguing that we try to do things where there is not money available. To sustain work, we must have a funding strategy. But I have seen over dozens of nonprofits that I have worked with that when they are truly ready for federal grants, they are no longer scrambling, right? They're no longer mission drifting to find money. They are one, clear on their mission, crystal clear. They know exactly what they do and exactly what they do not do. Number two, they are working toward that mission in any administration. Number three, they determine their mission, vision, and programs regardless of funding, not because of funding. They know what they are funding to, what they are finding funding to do, right? What they are fundraising for. They are not identifying funding opportunities and creating programs that fit a funding opportunity. And I think one of the hardest lessons of 2025 and the massive grant cancellations that we have seen is that organizations built programs around federal grants. And because those grants had been available for sometimes 10 years, that was the only funding source they had. And so we're watching nonprofits shut down entire programs. And I suspect part of that is because they built the program around the funding opportunity and not the other way around. So, yes, federal grants often require organizations to do something that is a little bit different than business as usual. But organizations that are ready for federal grants are capitalizing on opportunities that allow them to do something they've wanted to do for a long time, right? It's allowing them to take advantage of a funding opportunity because they already have plans in place. Maybe it's in their strategic plan, right? They really want to do the work that they are going to apply for federal funding, as opposed to there being a federal funding opportunity that is tangentially related to what they do, and so they build a program around it. I'm going to ask you a reflection question or a question in the chat. And this one is just a reflection question. So, have you consistently served, and you being the organization, has your organization consistently served the same community or the same issues over time? Are you deeply committed to that mission? And do you partner with other organizations when the work extends beyond your zone of genius? Right? It's so critical to have partnerships in place or at least verbal agreements about what happens when there's funding available, to be able to really work with other partners in areas where you don't need to be doing work, right? And so we can avoid that mission creep, and stay committed to exactly what we need to be doing. Number two, you're already thinking about federal grants. Well, you're in the session, so you at least are thinking about federal grants, right? But often organizations will start to toss around the idea of going after federal grants long before they actually determine they're ready to apply. And so it's a good thing when I hear that organizations are bringing up federal grants, that there's been some talk and maybe even some early action. So you might be thinking about the capacity that you need to pull off an application or to remain compliant if you were awarded. You might have started identifying federal agencies that are most likely to fund your organization. Maybe you've bookmarked an RFP or NOFO, or maybe you've even downloaded one and tried to read it cover to cover. So I know that just because you're here today, you're at least interested, right, in the idea of federal grant readiness. So I would be curious to see in the chat if you have already explored federal opportunities, or if you have not even looked for a federal opportunity, what has held you back? So I'll pause for a second. And so I'm getting some direct messages and some messages in the chat. Overwhelmed, yes, completely. Federal grant research and trying to get your feet can feel incredibly overwhelming. Yep. I also got a direct message that says we've explored some, but ultimately have decided it's too much, right? Fear. Yeah. Yep. Yep. These are very common responses, especially as you first start thinking about federal grants. Number three, you might be ready if you are a learning organization with leadership buy-in. This is critical. To me, when I talk about a learning organization, what I mean is that you're an organization that approaches things with curiosity, you're open to doing things differently, you're willing to make investments of time, and you're willing to move at the speed of trust. And I'll share some examples either here or later about what could possibly go wrong. But if your team is a learning team and you're adapting and you're planning long term, you're in a growth posture, right? And while my specialty is in getting organizations prepared for federal grants and writing those federal grants, being truly prepared means knowing that you'll need to make some investments to manage the funding when you get it. And this is likely to include things like new staff or professional development for those staff. And those are things we can write into the grant. So the money isn't the problem, possibly. You also might need technology upgrades or other, supply investments. And again, these items can often be built into a federal grant. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't take time, right? And it doesn't mean that a team won't be incredibly frustrated if they're already busy and strapped and just don't think that they have the time for it. So if you are the only person in your organization advocating for federal grants, your organization is not ready. You have to bring some of the leadership team and potentially some of the board along with you. So here's my cautionary tale. I had a client that initially preferred that I interface only with their vice president of development, right? So I would get on calls with the vice president. I'd say, here are the 16 things I need for this federal grant. If this is something we want to go after, she would run around collecting all those things. And in some ways, it made my job really easy. And she always came back with reasonable answers, right? By the time she left the organization about a year later, we had secured two federal grants, the first two federal grants this organization had ever received. And I also found out what was really going on. She had been making up information instead of getting it from their internal evaluation and program leads, because those two people were not bought in to a federal grant strategy and they were stonewalling her. And so, to get around their refusal to participate, she started making things up, but then presenting them to me as if they had come from this larger team. They had not been brought along in the process, right? And you can imagine how those grants went for them. The outputs and the outcomes were unattainable. The staff felt like they were failing because the outputs and outcomes were impossible to reach. The way that it had been described to me seemed reasonable enough. A reviewer agreed that it was reasonable enough to fund the program, but ultimately it was absolutely not reasonable. And if the program and evaluation folks had been at the table to set those numbers and really describe the processes, those numbers would never have made it into a proposal. So today, I still work with this client, but we have shifted completely into grant strategy and coaching, and we haven't returned to federal grant writing quite yet. I think we'll get there, but we have to have the resource. We have to resource these teams, right, with the knowledge and confidence, and frankly, desire to agree to even participate in a federal grant process again, because it ended up being really awful for them. And so the risks of not having leadership buy-in are numerous. I cannot overstate that you really need to bring people along this process. So this is just a reflection. You don't have to tattle on your leadership in the chat. So just think this one through. But does your leadership team support the learning curve that federal grants demand? Do they make professional development a priority? Have their actions demonstrated a willingness to make investments in people and or technology? These are really critical questions to think through. And I'm not necessarily looking for a yes or no. You're not looking for a yes or no. You're really looking for a list of actions that show you, that demonstrate that they really are ready to engage in a process like this. Number four, your programs have structure. You have repeatable activities. You have clear outcomes, and you know who benefits and how they benefit from the program. That's the core of every single federal grant. Program design with measurable results. Even better, you might have logic models, right? Again, this is a reflection. Please don't out anyone in the chat, but can you describe your programs, goals, activities, and outcomes? And I'm going to push you here. So often, I will talk to organizations that tell me that they have goals, they have activities, they have outcomes. But when I really push, when I dig to find out what those things are in detail, they might respond with things like, well, we just changed things a bit, so our outcomes aren't as relevant as they used to be, right? Or we've been tracking the same outputs for a long time, we've grown substantially, but we really aren't tracking outcomes. Or we've been tracking short-term outcomes, but we don't know if things have changed for our clients. Or we know our programs are great. We have a wait list. Everybody needs us, right? These are comments that indicate to me that the team needs to get together and iron out their intended impact and likely adjust their tracking systems and procedures so they can track impact beyond a single year. Number five, this is a huge green flag, okay? You've invested in evaluation, data, and financial systems. Maybe it's not perfect, right? Maybe there have been hiccups along the way, but the organization has made conscious moves. You're doing things like building spreadsheets for grants management, or maybe you've even invested in grants management software. You have a bookkeeper, or you've outsourced your bookkeeping, and you have an outsourced CPA that's using tools like QuickBooks, right? We don't have to get super fancy, but you do need to be using some sort of tracking software for your financial system if you're going to be successful with federal grants. You are setting up multi-year program goals, maybe even investing in external evaluation of one or more of your programs. That foundation matters so much. So federal grants are requiring tracking and reporting and auditing, right, in ways that typically go beyond what philanthropic funders require. If you're already thinking about the infrastructure that's going to support your programs, you're already showing that there is some leadership buy-in, right? Which we've talked about, and also some willingness to invest in those resources that can allow you to succeed. So this question is for the chat. Which of these, those three being evaluation, data collection and manipulation, or financial systems, has your organization made the most investment in? Where do you feel the most secure? I've got one for data collection and manipulation in my direct messages. I'll give it another minute to see if anyone else responds. Evaluation, great, which is often very much reliant on also having decent data collection and manipulation processes, right? So that's great. Yep. And I did get one other vote for a financial system. So it looks to me like we've got kind of an even split, or this is not uncommon, right? Organizations, there's no one way to go about building out your capacity as an organization, or helping your clients understand where they need capacity. So it doesn't surprise me that we've got a smattering across the three. Number six, you know your impact. Again, when we work on philanthropic private foundation grants, We often have stories, right? Stories are very compelling. When we talk about federal grants and we're talking about impact, we need to make sure that our stories have numbers that match our stories, right? Stories are examples within a data set. So those are our numbers. And we may even need insights, right? We need to make meaning out of the data that we have. So even if it's not a formal report, even if you don't have a, 2026 formal report, that your team still needs to be able to articulate these things. So this is not really this really happens when we move beyond just an annual review of outputs or maybe outcomes, and we're really looking at how have people's lives changed. And that often doesn't happen in a single year, right? When we talk about evaluation, in that 1 year, what are we actually changing? Typically just knowledge, right? And knowledge might change someone's life in a discernible way, but often we have to get to behavior change. And so, what is that behavior change that can happen after 1 year? So, how do we follow people through either multiple cohorts of a program or multiple years, even if they're no longer engaged in your organization's programming? How do we get beyond just a 1 year program evaluation? How do we get to actual impact? To get even more ready than just having your stories and your numbers and some of your impact statements all in alignment, you can also start to compare your outcome data with national data from think tanks or other national organizations focused on your issues. So, for example, let's say you serve youth. It's an easy one. So, let's say you're serving youth in foster care, and you have your set of impact numbers. Let's say around family reunification. You could check out the Annie E. Casey Foundation and see if they have reports that talk about family reunification, the numbers of successes, et cetera, and start to compare your data to a national data set, national statistics, and then really look at those best practices. What is kind of tricky about federal grants is that we often have to be compelling, not just at a local level. So you need to be doing something in a way that is compelling, not just locally, but also nationally. So if you really want to stand out in the federal landscape, there has to be something there that is a little bit unique. Whether it is whether your numbers look a lot better than maybe national statistics, whether you have a unique program component that the federal government is interested in knowing more about so that it could be scaled, right? These are the types of things you want to be thinking about as you are preparing your organization or clients for federal grants. Number 7, this might be the biggest green flag or biggest indicator that you are ready for federal grants. You've already managed public funding, whether that is city, county, or state grants. So why is this the biggest indicator? If you have managed city, county, or state grants successfully, there is a very solid chance you are already adhering to many federal requirements, whether you know it or not. Many cities, counties, states re-grant funding from federal departments and are required to pass along compliance to their grantees. If you received ARPA funds through your county government, you have already managed federal funding. Surprise, maybe it feels a little less scary now, right? Even when the funding is not federally originating. So when we talk about federally originating, what we mean is that the federal government passed a big chunk of money to a state or a county or a city or another government entity, and they re-granted it. Even when cities, counties, states are not re-granting federal funding, maybe it's their own funding from their own tax base, they often use very similar grants management procedures and practices. that they also use for those federal funds. So if you have public funding, any government funding, do some digging and find out where that money originates. And you may find that you're already managing federal dollars. This happens all the time. So I train in federal grants and I will ask folks in the room, and I'll do that now. Feel free to drop in the chat if you have public funding. And if you know that it's federal pass through, put that there. And if you're not sure, note that and put that in your follow-up notes to follow this conference. Um, when teams, leaders, organizations realize they've already been doing the scariest part of federal grants, which is management, and they didn't even know it, this information can build their confidence. It just makes it feel really possible all of a sudden when they thought there's just no way. We just don't have the capacity to do this. So if you get a second and want to drop that in the chat, there's no shame in admitting that you need to double check. It is not a common or an uncommon response to say, you know what, I think we have state funding. I don't know where it came from. Or, ooh, we got a lot of money during COVID. I bet it was ARPA. We've always just called it the county something something fund, right? Because your county came up with an interesting name for the fund. But I'm wondering now if that's ARPA. Maybe we have already managed this funding. So it's a great thing to go check because again, it can really build the confidence of your team and certainly of anyone who's going to be involved in the post-award management. Now, on the writing side, you're still going to have to tackle your own, fear of writing a long proposal, reading through a long RFP, coming up with all of the attachments, et cetera. But you have the skills, you can do this. It's very similar to writing foundation grants, just a little bit longer. You got to break it apart. But knowing that you've already been able to manage this funding often really does help move your leadership along. And so we've talked a little bit about bringing leadership along with you, right? And so that is certainly something that this one can really help convince leadership that they may actually be ready. Number 8, you're building capacity with AI. So AI can be a little bit controversial, and I'll provide the disclaimer now that if you aren't using AI in grants, this isn't a red flag. So the opposite of this one is not, that you're not ready for federal grants if you're not using AI. In fact, there are several federal agencies that have come out and said either you may not use AI, or have said use it, but use it real carefully, right? And so there are certainly many, many things to be thinking about when we think about AI and grant writing. And so I don't want to give the impression that if you're not using AI, you're not ready for federal grants. That being said, AI, I think, is helping to level the playing field. It's helping grant writers generate content faster, right? Organize data, focus more on strategy because they're spending less time in sort of the copy and paste, you know, mire that we can all end up in sometimes. So, one of the biggest fears I often hear about federal grants is that they just take so long to put together. And in the past, most small to mid-sized organizations chose to outsource their federal grant writing to consultants. And that's not terrible. And it's still certainly a practice today. But when I worked in-house, I wanted to learn to write federal grants. It's what was going to keep me in the profession. I actually knew that staying in sort of the private foundation side of things, I would burn out and I wouldn't be as excited to do my job. And so I wanted to learn federal grants. And so for my organization, applying for federal grants, inadvertently was a way to keep me, right? It was a way to retain the talent that they already had in-house by helping me build that set of skills. So I hope that as AI, does speed up our work, I can imagine that more in-house grant writers do have the time to take on larger federal grant writing projects. So in the chat, are you using AI to speed up your grant writing? If so, is it saving you substantial time? And I'm always curious if folks are keeping track of their time and if they know how many hours they're saving a week. I can't tell you what I'm saving a week, partly because I'm not grant writing, being in a federal grant often enough right now to be able to tell you that. But what I can tell you is that I have simplified so many processes that used to take 2 or 3 hours at a time and can now be done in about 5 minutes, right? And so I know that AI is speeding up. I don't know exactly how many hours a week it's saving. Um, Dr. Jenny says, I'm working on an NSF grant, and at first they said no AI was allowed. Then they said it was okay as long as you disclose which parts of the proposal were generated with the help of AI, along with taking, privacy security precautions. Yeah, I could get up on a soapbox about the challenges of funders saying you can't use AI, because I think it's a little bit challenging right now to figure out even what is AI and what is not AI. Like what is considered AI from the perspective of NSF, for example. How many of us use Grammarly that has AI built into it? So, my question, rhetorical to you, Dr. Jenny, is like, okay, if I click accept suggestion in my Grammarly Pro, do I now have to put a note in my NSF grant proposal that I used AI? I don't know. I don't think that's really what they're after, right? So it's a little bit challenging to try to figure out, how are we to number one define what is sort of reasonable AI usage and what is not reasonable for each funder. Is it truly no AI, or is it, hey, there needs to be a note at the bottom that says you used AI in some parts? Do you have to highlight every part that was AI, right? We're just in this moment of massive transition. The rules are going to be constantly changing. And so ultimately, you and your organization have to figure out what is your comfort level with using AI, and then paying close attention to funders when they say, you can or you cannot use AI, or maybe they're not saying anything at all. I will share that here locally in St. Louis, we had a our local Grant Professional Association chapter had a funder panel with 3 funders. And this was I guess this was just about a year ago. And we asked, can we be using AI? Like, how do funders feel about AI and grant writing? And all 3 unequivocally said AI is a tool and you should use every tool at your disposal. And please use it responsibly, right? And what we have seen, certainly from a corporate foundation side, but also on the federal side, funders are seeing 4, 5, 6 times as many proposals as they have ever seen before. And so part of the pushback on the use of AI is like, hold up, right? Please stop sending us all. We don't even have the capacity, the human capacity to read all these proposals. So I understand what funders are getting at from that perspective. It's a really tough nut to crack. So folks are saying yes, definitely, using AI, saving time, not exactly sure how much. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, one of my hopes for AI is that we actually are able to 5 minutes to close. Okay, one of the things I'm hoping we're able to do with AI is give in-house grant writers a little bit more time in order to be able to think about pursuing or putting together a federal grant strategy. Number 9, you see grants as strategic, not just financial. So some of the coolest grants I have ever worked on, and these were all funded, so it tells you something about what makes them unique, is that the applicant was able to propose and achieve something beyond just continue a program or grow a program. So one used federal funding to actually pay an insurance billing specialist to build out a new billing code. so that they could recoup more of their health service delivery through Medicaid here in Missouri. Like, how cool is that? They actually created a new billing code, and convinced, yeah, insurance companies and the state to pay for it. So very cool. In another example, about a dozen organizations all got together to work on gun violence prevention among youth. The work began with a federal grant, but now, because of just such a deep and sustained network that they built, they've been able to really diversify. And so when their federal funding was cut, it didn't shake the program. They've moved forward as a coalition. And I also just want to say that the reality is you're not going to get every federal grant you apply for, and the chances of getting the very first federal grant you ever apply for are honestly pretty slim. But so many of my clients have been able to get the program that was designed as the result of a federal grant writing process funded by a philanthropic source. Federal grants are more rigorous, right? They require more planning, they require more detail. And often that is more detail and more planning than you might need from a philanthropic funder, but it positions you for some of the more advanced or those funders that are funding fewer organizations but are looking for that really deep impact. I always like to say that I like a federal grants process because it puts a timeline on the planning. Teams will back burner planning, right? It's never the priority. It's never going to be the priority to put a new program on paper with the details. So when you find out you have a deadline that's 6 or 8 weeks out, like most federal funding, you are going to find out whether something is a priority, right? That team is either going to come together and do that planning or they're not. And that ends up being a really great indicator of planning. So I want to spend just the last couple of minutes here. Gosh, it's 2025, right? And what is new? What is actually true? And what can we expect? And I have been asked 101 times whether any organization should be even thinking about federal grants in 2025. And my very honest answer is it depends. Organizations that explicitly do DEI work are unwavering in that work and aren't ready to fight a legal battle probably should not pursue federal grants. That is a whole workshop in and of itself. But that is the group of organizations that I think are best positioned to pay attention, but wait. There are many, many organizations out there, however, that are not explicitly stating that they do DEI work. It's not the core of their work. And instead, DEI might show up in a way that they talk about their clients, right? It really might be there as on their website or in their program materials as a signal that they're trying to be very clear. We serve everyone, right? It is both unconscionable that our government is demanding the erasure of people, their histories, their identities, and the role that the government has played in their suffering. I'm not here to argue against that. And there are stakes if we as a sector completely disengage in federal grants. There are very real repercussions if the sector stops applying for federal funding. It's the largest funder, right? It's really important that we stay engaged. And I'm almost out of time here. So I do just want to say that there are grants that are coming out. Pay attention, keep your eye on what's available. There might be something that your organization could be eligible for. And I just want to draw your attention to this last slide. You can come back and visit it. My email's here, connect with me on LinkedIn. And then there is, within the grab bag or the swag bag for the conference, there is a special discount if you are interested in learning more about federal grants. I have a training and learning community, and there is a discount, and the discount is only for attendees of this conference. So grab that, and thank